There's been a large change in terms of thinking about research in general and research specifically related to patients. In the last few years, people have talked more and more about patient-centered outcomes research, or PCOR. This is a new philosophy. It really says that if we are involved in health decision-making, it's critical that we have research to help inform those health decisions that would be important for an individual patient to make the best decision. A lot of our research has been previously done focusing on outcomes that clinicians or researchers think are important. When we think about a condition like rheumatoid arthritis, we've been focusing on things like joint damage and joint swelling, and even inflammation markers in the blood. And while these are important to the researcher, and they're important to the clinician because they're telling us something about the disease, they're really not giving us the whole story. They're not telling us about the patient's piece of what they experience. Patient-centered outcome research tries to bring the patient experience into the conversation and tries to figure out what the best methods are to incorporate this type of perspective not only into the research itself, but also into translating those research findings into outcomes that are better for patients. Patient-centered outcome research focuses on a large number of different topics, including things like patient-reported outcomes. These are things like questionnaires that a patient would complete to tell us about pain or fatigue or sleep or other symptoms that they're having. But it's also understanding more about what patients' individual beliefs and attitudes and values are, because those are also important in terms of making health decisions. We haven't had very good ways to measure those things in the past, and that's part of the challenge of patient-centered outcome research, is developing the methods to be able to do these types of things better. Another important area and aspect of patient-centered outcome research is things like adherence to medications and understanding why patients may or may not take medications. And that involves things like beliefs. It also involves things like values, and it involves things like, do I understand why I need to be taking this medication? Do I understand why it's important for me to receive this to change the outcome of the disease? These are all the types of research that we're very interested in the center.